Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 79 of the Peak of Serenity podcast. I am one of your hosts, Emerson, and as always, I am joined by my co host, Namali.
Hello.
And this week, we are going to be covering a few different topics, but notably, we are going to be catching up on our questions and lore, and then maybe talking a little bit about the recap that Max and Scripe did talking about the world first race.
Roger.
Roger.
Like Max and Roger.
Max and Roger, my bad.
No, you're good. You're good.
But before we get into that, there's been a few changes this week.
Yeah, we can jump into the changes. I think one of the ones we'll sort of talk probably a little bit about our recap of the raid week. So we can get into that. So
Okay.
a couple of quick just week in review things. And we'll do these sort of in order. So hopefully it flows well. The first one is basically the what is it? The soul crescent things and like the deathbound shards.
Yeah.
Which are the things
the
that basically
conduit
grant
items, the random conduit items.
Yeah, the conduit upgrade items, they now grant them as spec specific. So they will try and upgrade a spec specific conduit instead of just a general one, which is cool.
Yeah.
Seems like a little, like, I don't know, maybe this should have been something that they started with.
Yeah, this should have been in a year ago.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm trying to think is like, maybe it makes sense. I wonder if it was like a tech thing where
No.
like,
This was I 100% believe that there were two things that led to it being like that. One of them was that they were really trying to go in on this like class not spec thing. If you remember that from the lead up to Shadowlands, they're like, oh, this is like you are your class. We don't have 36 different classes. We've got 12, and so they wanted it to be like the conduits were class based. I think that's part of it. The other part is it's a longer grind.
Yeah. No, that's true. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's probably, yeah, you're probably right, the class thing and then just the time investment, but it's still, I mean, to be fair, it's not like what always upset me was like I very rarely was ever in Brewmaster spec this expansion.
Yeah.
So like I very rarely got those endurance conduits. And so like the first like 4 times I had upgrade things, like it was always a like Brewmaster specific endurance conduit because I was like, number one, never that spec, never saw them drop higher than like 2 or like 1.
So you don't actually have to be in that loot spec to get the conduits. You just didn't get them to drop.
Oh really? Oh,
I've got
no
a 252 Zuin's Bond, I think it is, because it drops from one of the first bosses in Sanctum, who is not Windwalker loot spec.
Interesting. So I have no idea how this stuff works. I thought it was. Sorry, I thought conduits somehow were loot.
They are push personal and ignore your loot spec.
Interesting.
But wow. Yeah, like that's exactly. So I actually just used 4 Deathbound shards last weekend, and got lucky and got one of my important conduits up to 239. But it would have been a lot nicer if it were only Brewmaster conduits.
Exactly.
One thing I'm not clear on from their announcement is whether it will only prioritize your spec one. So like if you have a bunch of 226 conduits left and you use a Deathbound shard, it will always pick a Brewmaster one. But then if you have 226 ones but no Brewmaster ones, if it'll pick a non-Brewmaster one, for example, to upgrade.
Yeah, I would assume it will pick like your non ones at that point, like your non spec specific ones. But yeah, I don't know. That's weird. We'll see. We'll see how it's probably. I mean, it probably will not work that way, and it'll probably just fizzle. Right? It'll just be like you get nothing.
I mean,
if you don't change your loot spec.
I hope what happens is that like so, if you have not used the Deathbound shards, the way it works is that if you have a 226, it bumps it up to 239. So you have to get everything up to right now. You have to get everything up to 239 before you start getting 252s from the Deathbound shard. So what I'm curious about is like I have Brewmaster conduits. Most of my Brewmaster conduits are up to 239, but I have 226 Mistweaver and Windwalker conduits. So if I use a Deathbound shard, am I going to get a 252 Brewmaster conduit or a 239 Mistweaver conduit?
I think you'll get a 252 Brewmaster. I
I
think just
hope that's how it works, because if it
reading the way
works
it
the other
works,
way,
yeah.
people are gonna be mad.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's gonna be yeah, that will be a little rough. So, but I mean, a good change nonetheless. But to your point, I think about a year late, like in
Yeah,
terms of like yeah, using these upgrade things to get what you wanted. So, so yeah, so usually, or I guess this should be now live, right?
I don't think
Um,
so. I think it comes in with the reset.
oh, reset. Okay, this is a this week announcement. Okay,
So
cool.
by the
So yeah,
time you're
so
listening to this episode, it should be live. Yeah, it will go live with next week's restarts. So by the time you're
gotcha.
listening to this episode, it's probably live. But if you're watching us live right now, it is not up. Do not use your Deathbound shards this
Yeah,
weekend.
do not use those things. So yeah, so that is the Deathbound Shard sort of update, now spec specific. Next up in terms of things that happened last week is the Horde Hall of Fame for Sanctum of Domination will close at the end of this reset. So there has now been 100 Horde guilds that have killed Mythic Sylvanas across the world, which is amazing. Congratulations, all you Horde guilds. There are still about 80 slots left on the Alliance leaderboard.
I'm actually pulling
to-
it up right now so we can get exact numbers. As of our recording right now, there are 14 kills on the Alliance Hall of Fame.
that's just
It's
that's
impressive.
I think that's actually probably better than it was in Castle Nathria. I think Castle
So
Nathria was like 8 or 10, right?
so Wowhead actually has a great little breakdown of it that I'm gonna pull up.
Okay.
So in Uldir they were 12, BOD 15, Eternal Palace 19, Nyalotha 20. So it was like, trending up.
Yeah.
Castle Nathria 12. We are looking at 14 right now. Um, so when they wrote the article, Alliance only had 12, which
Yeah.
was consistent with previous tiers, but basically, um, whatever gain there was during BFA for Alliance Mythic rating, CE rating, has
Yeah.
basically been lost.
Yeah. It pains me to like look at this, right? Because I don't I don't know if there's a way Blizzard can fix this, right?
I
Like
don't think they can fix it, because ultimately or I guess I should say, I think the way they can fix it, they have two options. They can either make it so that the group size is smaller, so that it's
mhm,
you don't need as many people, or
yeah.
they can make it so you can do it cross faction,
Yeah.
pretty much.
Yeah, because I think the only way you have people switch factions is by moving some sort of power into that faction, which is the original reason everyone's Horde, right? Is that Horde
The alliance
racials
ratios are also better now. Like the
they
only
are, yeah.
one that's like really noticeably better on horde side is the goblin rocket jump, which is like,
Right.
for all of those classes without personal mobility, it's like the best thing ever.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that the issue is that I don't think they're strong enough to warrant the change, at least in like rating, right? Like the game, like the part of the game that
Yeah,
requires the most people
it's
for
funny
folks who
because
are
they
gonna
actually
counter it.
had an opportunity for there to be like one tier, very clear, like, oh, the alliance is just better this tier in Castle
Yeah,
Nathria with the dwarf racials,
it's
and
true.
then they
It's
made it
true.
not work on all the relevant mechanics.
Yeah. Which is yeah. It's so funny that like all this like this faction balance just stems from like what is it like Wrath was when it really started to turn. Um and then yeah, then like what was it? WAD was like sort of probably the worst. That's when I swapped. But it was probably bad even before that. So in terms
Yeah,
of like just racials being stronger, and then they killed racials, and everybody stuck to what they stuck to, right? So
yeah. I mean, ultimately, I think it was inevitable whether there were really powerful racials or not, just because this kind of two faction social system doesn't have like a stable equilibrium with both factions being like large and
that's true.
present. Because we see that on like classic as well, right? Every realm that has a lot of people either is a horde server or it's an alliance server. Every single
Right?
one.
Yeah.
Um, and the only ones that I'm aware of that are even close to being relatively balanced are like medium-sized PvE servers.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's just tough now. Like people will roll with their friends, people roll with large groups, and
Right.
yeah, there's a lot more communication in terms of like where you go from a faction perspective. So yeah, I don't know if I mean to be fair, like I think the faction system to your point, sort of a relic of the past. And I don't know. I mean, you can definitely probably make games that do well with factions, but I feel like a two faction system ultimately
Yeah.
ends up like this. Like you almost need like a third to sort
I
of
think you do need a third. Like
balance. Yeah.
Daok has a third. Dark Age of Camelot had a third. And what is it? What are the new ones? New World has a third faction. And like the dynamic there is like if one faction starts getting too big and too strong, then the other two kind of like say truce, we're going against the big guy.
Yeah, exactly.
And that helps even things out.
Yeah. So yeah, so I mean, we'll see what they do in the future. Like it's sort of crazy that, yeah, 12 at the time that WoW had wrote the article 12, I think we said like 14 now have killed it.
Yeah.
So it's gonna be a while till we get cross and the problem is too that the gate sort of cross faction mythic raids behind both Hall of Fames being closed. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like be a while.
It'll
Be
be
a
a
while.
while. Like
Yeah.
nobody can. That's one thing too. Nobody can pug Mythic basically, unless this
Yeah.
is nobody can pug Mythic unless they're on one of the giant realms until both
Yeah.
Hall of Fames close, which then also exacerbates the problem where like Area 52, Illidan, and Bleeding Hollow and those realms have like all of the population,
Exactly. Yeah.
and all the other realms are dead.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see if they make a change moving forward. It'll be nice to maybe get some cross. Like, I don't know if they'll ever go full cross faction. I think
Yeah,
that might be like too much to entangle. But
yeah. I
I
think they'll
think
let us do
opening up it
cross faction
early.
PVE.
Yeah, maybe a little bit earlier. A little bit earlier. So yeah. So Horde Hall of Fame closed. Congratulations to those 120 or so guilds that got it. This feels quick, by the way, compared to
Yeah,
Natural.
I'm really curious what the time from like release of Mythic is for each of these tiers.
Yeah.
I didn't actually pull that up, but I'm really curious what it is because it does feel fast.
Yeah. Yeah. It does for sure. Um, All right. So before we get into some like tuning, some dungeon and raid tuning, I did want to bring up one quick point which you talked about in the pre-show, which is the current co-studio lead, Mike. I guess Jabara is how you pronounce his
Yeah,
last
Mike
name.
Ybarra.
Mike has been streaming some Blizzard games over this weekend, most notably WoW, crushing some 20s on his warrior, I heard, and also playing a little bit of like Diablo 2. What is it, remastered or resurrected or
Yeah, I think it's
uh,
resurrected. It's the
yeah, so,
remaster.
yeah, the remaster. Which, by the way, very cool. Actually, if you watch 2 hours of a stream on Twitch, you got like a beta key for this weekend.
Interesting.
Uh,
Okay.
and I played a little bit of it. So I guess real quick aside before we talk about his comments, we'll do a quick little D2 drop in. It's D2, but it looks better. So like it's very jarring coming from like playing Diablo 3 and how fast that game is and like going into D2 and just being like hit, run away from a blue mob, hit, run away from a blue mob and then like die a bunch of times.
Yeah.
Um but I mean it looks gorgeous. I can't speak to so I never purchased Warcraft 3 remastered.
Yeah.
Um based on just a lot of the
I mean,
initial feedback
everything
from
that
it.
I've heard is that Diablo 2 Resurrected is just infinitely better put together
Yeah.
than War 3 Reforged.
Yeah, the switch between graphics super cool. Works really well and then the updated graphics themselves, it looks like a brand new game that still plays like D2. So,
That's
if you're
awesome.
not ready for playing D2, you're not going to like it. But
Yeah.
it looks like they put some I mean, it doesn't it, you can tell that they put some time into it to make it like a faithful remaster, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry. Aside,
Now we
more
need a
about
War
Mike's
3
comments.
Reforged.
We do. God, dude, I would play the heck out of that. But yeah, so Mike Ybarra, studio head, also known as Quick, goes by Quick on Twitch and in games. Made a couple of comments. Most notably, I think he made an offhanded comment doing a dungeon that they should remove the AOE caps. I believe it was particularly Mists, or sorry,
It
it
was
was
a
particularly
Mists 20, yeah.
yeah, where he made those comments, which I think is pretty funny. A bunch of people sort of jumped in, like there's clips of it floating around, like oh, even the game director or sorry, the studio head wants it to change, but
So,
um,
notably, there are at least 2 pulls and mists where you just unavoidably have more than 5 targets. There's
Yeah.
well, one of them's in the maze, so you might not get it. It's got 6 targets, so it's like just barely over it. And then there's the when you go after the after the maze, you go
Hmm.
left, and there's the
Big
all
pull.
the slugs.
Slugs, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That pole has 6 or 7 mobs in it, and then most people have the wasps come in the middle of it. So you're at like 10 mobs or something like that in that pole.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you have the pull. You could do also double up 2 of the pulls after that.
Yep, pretty
And yeah,
safely.
also did too, yeah. So yeah, there's a bunch of people sort of freaking out, like even Mike wants to change, but it's sort of I think I made this comment in the pre-show. Like Mike's got a bunch of other stuff to worry
Yeah,
about other
he's
than making
not
sure
game
WoW.
director. He's co-studio head or whatever.
Yeah.
There is actually I do think it is important that there is a separation between the people designing the games and the people that are like running the business.
Yeah.
Not to say I don't think his feedback is correct here. Just
Oh,
that
yeah,
in
no, I agree
general,
with
I
him.
think that having that kind of firewall between the people trying to design a good game and the people trying to make money off of it, like, is good. Like, it's good that those two things are separate. And
Yeah.
I actually think that the lack of firewall there is part of what has made WoW kind of insufferable sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens with Mike at the helm, but I mean, it just seems like he's just a dude who enjoys playing games. And so like
Yeah,
watching I watched maybe like a half hour of his stream. He just, seemed like a dad who liked playing video games and also happened to run a studio like a game studio, right? So um but
yeah,
yeah, it was funny about the AoE cap. People are like freaking out like they're gonna make the change now. It's like, come on, dude. Like,
yeah. For one thing, that's a relatively big change. Like
yeah,
we're talking lots of abilities getting adjustments to their code. Um, I
exactly.
wouldn't expect it before 10.0 personally.
No, not at all. Not at all. But yeah, so that's Mike plays games. Cool. So the final sort of last week wrap up thing is Blizzard did a massive amount of tuning,
Yes.
to most notably Mythic Plus, and then Painsmith. So I think we could talk a little bit maybe first about the Mythic Plus stuff, and then I think Painsmith will be a slightly longer conversation.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they basically did a full pass through of a bunch of different dungeons, sort of making some targeted uh nerfs, I'll say, right?
Yeah.
So things like in the other side, the enraged spirits rage duration was dropped by a second to 5 seconds from 6 seconds, so you end up with like one less explosion. Very
Yep.
good. They reduced the damage of Echelon's
Second
the
boss.
second boss
Yeah.
in Halls of Atonement. His leap now does 15% less damage, which is nuts.
Also an extra minute on the timer, which is retroactive. So if you completed the dungeon in 31 minutes and 2 seconds before, now that is counted as in time.
Oh, okay, cool. I didn't realize it was retroactive. That's awesome. Um, I'm trying to think. I'm just looking at this list. I don't know a couple other big ones. Um, the Juggernaut Rush from the first boss in Sanguine Depths had its damage reduced, which actually did a 15 Sanguine.
Yeah.
Very noticeable. Like you
Yeah.
can miss a soak now, even at 50. Like I know 15 is not terribly high, but you can definitely have like 3 people soak, and it feel fine, not too crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Also,
they also. Oh, sorry.
40% damage reduction on Slam from Decia in the first boss of Theater.
Oh yeah.
40%. That's so Decia the Decapitator is the warrior in that like triome kind of boss.
Hmm.
Um that just slapped tanks. And now slaps tanks basically 40% less. It's great.
That's awesome. Yeah. So lots of changes to make. I mean, just generally make the dungeons easier,
Yeah.
which is cool. Um, yeah, I don't know why they waited. Like, it just seemed like a very broad strokes thing. I'm wondering what triggered all this.
I
So
think a lot of this is, and this is so I think a lot of this is looking at the dungeons over the past month and seeing which dungeons did actually like where was prideful kind of covering problems. And I
yeah,
think that a number of these changes are related to that because you know using Mist as an example, you always took Prideful into the first boss. Um, Sanguine, you would usually have Pride for the first boss. Stitch
Mhm.
Flesh, you would have Pride for that. Uh, Theater, you would not. And the other side change, you wouldn't have. You of course are not using Pride on the Enraged Spirit, but maybe the reduction in number of people that are Night Fae this tier meant that now that
It's
was more of a
true.
problem.
That
Um,
is true.
so I think some of it's prideful and some of it is realizing, hey, this actually was overtuned, and then just a couple other nice changes in there with it, like the gluttonous ticks losing stacks of engorge when they leave combat, pretty nice, um,
Oh yeah,
but not a huge change.
nice. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, seems like yeah, just nerfs across the board. Mythic Plus, sure, good. Get your what is it? The Stone Master. Couldn't
Yep.
remember the name of the achievement, so work on getting that. And then the other big change in the raid this time, so moving into Sanctum, they made some changes to Painsmith.
Yeah.
So the I guess the first one less boring one, but Painsmith, the boss, spiked balls, and the horrors, the ads that spawn at the end of phase two, all have 10% less health, in mythic difficulty, so 10% health reduction. Um, which is I'll tell you sucks. I'll tell you why in a sec. At least in our progression, I'm not a huge
Uh-huh.
fan of at least the Painsmith health nerf. But then the bigger one is now a gap appears in every row of spikes during the intermission, or what they're calling stage two, the spike wall phase, which is honestly
Yeah.
like I'm slightly upset about this, by the way.
Yeah.
Um,
All right. So
so
walk us through it.
yeah, so I only we got about an hour and a half of progression last week. So these changes all went in with the reset on the 10th. So this week that you're listening, these are all live. And so we got about an hour and a half of progression in on that. And it was, I mean, the intermission was tough. Like the movement, like as a monk, making sure you time your transcend, making sure that you use it when there's like you both have to look at the spike wave coming at you and where you're porting to, so you don't port into the next wave of spikes. There's a little bit of timing too with like fire drops, making sure there's not fire on that. But it added a layer of complexity in the intermission, which was cool, right? It definitely was annoying. I know that our priests hated it. Um,
Yeah.
I know that there are certain classes that just don't have the ability to get over the spikes very easily, because they either don't have the right conduit or sorry covenant, or their class just doesn't afford them the ability to do it.
Yeah.
Um, those folks were a little bit annoying, but I thought it was fun. It was interesting. It was sort of like the a difficult part of the fight, I'd say. Like
Yeah.
probably the most difficult was getting through the intermission, right? Because the
I think
main
it's still the most
phases.
difficult. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's true, that's true. But all the difficulty was in the intermission, like just making it cleanly through that versus, the normal phases are they're hard, but they're very much like a dance, right? It's like
Yeah.
movement's fairly choreographed. What you have to do at each point is fairly choreographed, so it's not too bad. But yeah, the change itself basically now every row will have a gap in it, so you no longer have to sort of figure out in the middle how to get past a row that has no gap. The problem, and here's my biggest issue with this, is the problem is that they basically made the row that had no gap, the gap now always appears in the center, which means, and the problem was they didn't change the other logic around the way that the gaps form. So if you
Yeah,
guys
they
aren't
have
aware,
two sensors in a row, basically, every time, right?
yeah, yeah. So the way that the gaps normally work is it was always one in the center, and then you went left or right, and then it was the next three were basically opposite. So if you went right first, it was right in terms of holes. If you
Yeah.
went left first, it was left right left. Then you got an unbroken one, so that you had to get over it, and the one immediately beyond the unbroken one was always a center. So
Yeah.
you could always like know the center would somewhat be clear. Now the way it works is you basically go center, left, or right, left, right for the next three, and then it's center, center. So like it's basically removes a lot of the movement requirements in the middle. And as a healer, right, there was always this sort of like touch and go of like, can I stop and heal
Yeah.
someone to save them, or do I have to keep moving? And now it's like, well, like we drop tide at the beginning, a revival towards the end just to make sure no one's in super danger of ticking down. But in general, like the healing requirements in the middle are lower, and also like the movement requirements are lower. Because at least the way the strat that we do, right, is we always gate at the end. So for us, it's the actual dance is basically center, left, or right, left, right for the three, depending. Then it's
Yeah.
center, center, one to the side, depending. So it's either left or right, and then back to center to gate. And like that's the movement. So, like, it's not that hard. Like, I don't know. I mean, to be fair, I say it's not that hard, and we've had people die, in 40 attempts 20 times in the intermission, right? Never making it through,
Yeah.
which I'm not gonna make fun of anybody. It's still not super gimme. It's not a gimme, right? But
Yeah.
I think at the same time, like the difficulty here, the fact that I would have been fine with this if they changed the way the order worked, where you had to
If they
like
had like
where
moved the center up a row, so you went like center, left, center, left, right,
yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And not do 2 centers in a row because it basically gives you almost what, 10 or 12 seconds of just like limited movement. All you're doing is dodging fire on the ground and you're setting up for your final piece, your final movement. So, yeah, I'm I mean, I'm a little not exactly excited about the change. To be fair, I think at the end of the day, as I finish this off, it's like great, I get a quicker boss kill about this.
Yeah.
But I think the problem is like looking ahead. I really, it's more me looking ahead at the rest of the fights here. It's like, well, this is like the last hard one, right? Before
Yeah.
you just run over the next three, and then Sylvanas is like 100 pull boss, right? So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I don't know. Did you guys get a chance to progress the
We didn't get to pull pre-nerf.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so we didn't get to pull pre-nerf, so we started on Painsmith Friday. We got about an hour and a half in.
Hmm.
And intermission, definitely not a gimme. Plenty of people just like dying to spikes or oops, I touched the ball, or
Yeah.
someone running up ahead, woof, dropping fire in front of the entire group and then blocking us in, that kind of thing. Um, but I know like we had people that were frustrated because initially when we heard during the world first race, oh my god, like there's no gap, this is awful. I think it didn't actually end up being that way. It was kind of a cool thing
Oh yeah.
because there were a number of different ways you could do it, and you can just gate that wave, which is actually
Yep.
weird. Even though there's no longer, you know, a, a an un a wave with no gaps, we are actually planning to gate around wave 5, just as a way to like reset our position forward to give us more space to kind of move diagonally backwards, because that's there's not enough time even with something like a roar. If you could roar every single one, maybe, but generally, like when you're moving left to right, there's not enough time to just move exactly horizontally. You have to move diagonally backwards. So
Yep.
using the gateway to go forward, then to reset our position. So it's kind of like start kind of towards the front, go diagonal back, diagonal back, diagonal back, take the gate, do it again, and that's kind of how we're planning to approach it now.
Yep.
But like if there weren't a gap, we would still be able to do exactly that strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think I don't know, it's just to me, the other part of it is like the intermission is the difficult part of the fight because
Yeah,
like the rest of the fight is yeah, it's just is like really choreographed. Like your tank moves in a specific position. You have markers on people with chains. They're always going to be in like the right position in the middle. I guess the only difference is in like phase 3, there's like a weird movement with the chain people having to move like perpendicular to where the ball line. I think that's the word I want. Perpendicular to where the ball lines are coming, the spike balls are coming from, so the raid can charge and do damage while they don't clip them.
yeah,
But like, yeah, I don't know. It's one of the. It's funny. Like they're. I normally am the type of person where I'm like, if you're gonna make a fight easier before I get there, I'm fine with it. But I think my problem is I got enough of a taste of it in that hour and a half to be like, most people hate this, right? But for me, it's like I'm the type of person where like I want to perfect something. So like
yeah.
I will play like difficult platformers like the same level like
Like
40,
Cuphead.
50 times.
Yeah,
Yeah, like I'll play like Cuphead or I'll play like runner games, right? Because I need to hit like a pixel perfect jump to like make this and like yeah, I don't know. I like that sort of repetition. And so for me it was like one of those things where it's like I can get really good at this. I'm excited.
yeah,
Um and then, yeah, it's just sort of yeah, it is what it is. Now it's like there's like some AFK middle portion of the intermission where like you make a couple of side steps left and right,
yeah,
dodge some fire, and then like cool, you gate in like half a second after that. So
yeah. I do think I was really concerned about Painsmith being kind of a Xanash kind of boss, where it was just really tilting, and one Xanash notable for being, one person making a mistake wipes the entire raid, and with the health nerf especially, Painsmith is well out of that territory. But even before, with how much power we got from the domination sets, if you made it into phase 3 with like a DPS dead, you could still kill the boss.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. So you no longer have that sort of one person, and I don't think it's funny too. Like normally, like with Zanesh, I remember like specifically there would be times I'm like, just let me do this one. Like trade places, like I will do,
yeah,
or like somebody on the raid just be like, look, just trade places. I'll do this one. You, whoever was sort of messing up a couple times, do the other one.
yeah.
Um, and I didn't feel that. I mean, maybe we were just too early in progression to feel that way, but it didn't seem like I don't know. I don't think I would have gotten that upset if people died in the intermission because
I
it
think
wasn't.
it's when you
It
can
is
just use a
hard.
B-res on them. Like you can't use a B-res on Xanash, right?
That's true. Yeah.
You can use a B-res on someone that just eats spikes all the time in the intermission. Like, yeah, it'll be annoying, but it doesn't immediately wipe you.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Particularly with like the health nerf, and I guess that's the other side of it is the health. I don't know if you were doing this, but like the health nerf for us sucks because from a DPS perspective, we would reach. So the way that we have our cooldown set up from a healing perspective is we're cooldowning basically every trap set, and the problem is that the time between the first trap set and the third trap set, if we were just to DPS, is about 2.5 minutes. So like we have it's literally like we literally have to wait and hold DPS in phase 1
In
to
order to
get the
get the next
6th
trap set.
axe.
Yeah.
Yeah, to, like, get the timing right. It's so annoying, dude. It's
Yeah.
just
We are currently not planning to hold DPS, but if we do end up needing to do that, it will be for healer cooldowns.
yeah. Yeah, that's the I mean, that's it, and the nice part is I think that's gonna be the only hold spot because the couple of times we got to phase 3, I think, like, 3 times on Thursday last week, and it seemed like we would be okay in the final phase in terms of cooldowns, but,
Yeah.
yeah, that first hold is just it sucks because there's nothing. It's like another, like, Zakul type, like, nothing
Yeah.
going on, just, like, chilling, and so,
Yeah.
yeah, it's rough in the beginning, but, and the health nerf doesn't help that, like, I think the health nerf helps the balls and the horrors, but on
Yeah.
Painsmith, it's just like, now, it's our boomkins, we literally just let our boomkins do damage, I think, for most of it. Like, they do their cooldowns, and we just sort of chill like the rest of the DPS, so, um, but yeah.
Yeah.
Although it was interesting, we were hugging. I didn't realize that the enraged spikes start with the 6 axe throw. So I
Yeah.
was standing on the edge and ended up dying. I think the first time we did the whole DPS strat
Yeah.
because they popped up. So,
Yep.
um, but yeah, that's Painsmith. That sort of progression. Hopefully, we get a kill this week. But um, yeah, I'm super disappointed that this was the nerf that they chose to do in terms of like the intermission, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't know. I don't have enough time on the boss really to have too strong of an opinion, especially since we didn't like we had done prep to start on this boss last week. So
mhm.
we had been planning to gate the unbroken spike wave and things like that. And I don't know, it kind of felt like a rug pull where like, oh, we were all prepped for this like spike wave specifically, and then it wasn't
Yeah.
there anymore. But there's still definitely enough other stuff going on in the intermission that I think it's still fun.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some times where you'll put yourself the only nice part about the intermission is in most of the cases, it's you as an individual putting yourself in a bad position versus like any sort of like RNG or something like that, like causing your death.
Yeah,
Right. So like either you're like late with movement, you're behind the group, we didn't I mean to be fair, we haven't had many problems in terms of like fire being dropped ahead of us.
yeah,
Generally we just sort of use the idea of like don't linger like on a spike opening strip, like
yeah,
charge through, get out of the way, move next, right? Is sort of how we've sort of handled that. But yeah, I mean I can tell you every death that I had in the intermission has been because I
yeah,
try to do something cheeky and it did not work out in my favor, right?
yeah.
Like wait that half a second more to move and think I can get a roll off. I think I rolled into a spike ball because I
Nice.
tried to diagonal roll through 2 of them, which didn't work out in my favor,
Yeah.
one attempt. So,
Diagonals are a lie on this boss, by the way. Nothing
yeah,
works. Don't try and do anything diagonally. Move left, move right, move up, move down. Do not move diagonally.
Yeah. Yeah, so but yeah, I mean, I will hopefully get a kill this week, and then we get a couple of free bosses, so
One of the Brew Lounge regulars got a Painsmith kill this week, and literally 20 minutes later they posted Guardian down.
yeah, I'm
And
seeing a lot of, like,
they got Fate
5
Scribe later
pulls.
that night too.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's hilarious.
So I
Well, that's
yeah.
the to be fair, this is the first tier that so generally, like, when I do because I do a lot of the healer cooldowns for my guild, right? So generally, it's like I'll start of the week, see what we think we're gonna kill, and do cooldowns for, like, whatever we're on, and then the boss I think we're gonna get to. Last week, I literally was like, well, if we kill Painsmith this week and we have like an hour left, we're literally going to probably kill Guardian and get enough pulls on Fate Scribe to warrant like having something ready. So I basically did like healer cooldowns for everything but Sylvanas at this point. Just because I was like, if we get it down, it's like we're just blasting. So
Yeah.
um yeah, it's hopefully it's as free as people say. I'm assuming my guild will screw something up, but
Yeah.
uh, we'll see how it goes. So
I know the feeling.
um yeah. Awesome, awesome. So cool. Anything else on tuning or at least maybe Painsmith before we do a little bit of segue into the main topic?
I actually wanted to mention, so I brought up last week that we were considering like just having our DPS go blood set.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
we did actually do that. All our
Oh, how'd that
DPS.
work out for you?
So far a little bit early to say, but we did have a very messy remnant rekill this week. That basically we were carried by the blood set healing.
Oh really?
It was between that and the frost gem, like 20% of our raid HPS.
Holy shit.
We had a healer die like 2 minutes
Mhm.
before we killed the boss and didn't have a res for them.
Jesus.
And
You're-
just like it was a four and a it was like a actually it was less than 2 minutes. It was like a minute and a half. It was about a 4.5 minute kill, and they died in about 3 minutes to getting
Shit.
blown off the edge, and we didn't have a res for them, and we still just like blasted and got it,
That's
and
crazy.
had a buzzer beater finish where I called that we could beat the next orb expiring, the next bombs expiring.
Yeah.
Not quite.
Not quite.
Not quite. The Demon Hunter stayed on the platform though, so it was fine.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Oh god, that's hilarious. Yeah.
But
Yeah, so it's god, so that's a ton of HPS.
it is
Like
a huge amount of HPS. And so right now on Painsmith, it's really hard to judge because in the intermission, you have to like swap targets to a ball to get
yeah.
healing because it's actually unlike something like Atonement that ignores damage reduction effects. Painsmith or Bloodlink does not do that. So while Painsmith is doing his hammering during the intermission, he takes 99% reduced damage or something like that. So Bloodlink does 1% of its healing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And phase one right now for us is so quick, it has so little damage going out that there's really nothing for Bloodlink to do except for damage.
Mhm.
So it's like it looks pretty bad right now, but by the time we get to phase three, like the damage ramp on the rot damage in particular is pretty significant. So I expect it will help there. We're gonna see.
Nice.
Very curious to see how this goes. But I have high hopes for it because there's actually, if you look at, there's a lot of rot damage this tier. There,
Yeah.
so one of the big things that kills people on Guardian, obviously missing the energy cores is one of the things that just wipes guilds. But
Right.
another one is just people dying to Sentry Fire.
Yeah.
And on Fate Scribe, same thing, like people dying to the damage, just the ticking damage in the intermission.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So yeah, that no, I mean Bloodlink sounds like it'll be I mean if you're getting that good results with it, that's pretty awesome.
so yeah,
Nice.
I'm really interested to see how this is going to pan out. I think it could be really great.
Nice. I like that play. Yeah, we'll have to keep us updated on how that goes. So
Yeah.
awesome,
Also,
awesome.
also unholy low-key trolling on Painsmith in particular because of the intermission and the timing of the intermission. People lose so you can lose your Chaos Bane stacks by
Mhm.
not hitting things during the intermission. So you have to make sure you're hitting the balls at least a little bit so you don't lose. But also, let's say, for example, you go into the intermission with 14 stacks. Your options are lose your stacks by having them expire, or lose your stacks by getting a 15th stack, triggering Chaos Bane
On nothing.
on
Yeah.
nothing.
That's awesome.
So that's a thing. Kind of annoying. So even the other team in our guild that wasn't really having a serious conversation about like having their raiders all go Bloodlink,
Yeah.
was they were talking about, maybe it is correct for DPS to go Bloodlink on this
Yeah.
because of how badly the timer, the 90-second timer for Chaos Bane lines up with the intermissions.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's I didn't even think about that for DPS. That's funny. Yeah, no, that actually probably be a good idea. I'm just surprised, dude. Blood, yeah, so strong. That's crazy. That's crazy. Alrighty, all right. So I think then let us transition, I guess, into the big topic for today, which I think we just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about sort of the big review that Max and Roger did, right?
Yeah,
In terms of sitting down and going through the tiers. So of course, Max or Maximum from Limit, raid leader extraordinaire over there for Complexity Limit, and then also of course Roger Brown, uh, part of Echo. I guess he's an officer there, but he's
he's an
been an
officer.
officer. He's been sort of at the top of the Hunter game or World Force game with Method before Echo, and sort of been a staple in terms of in world first kills for forever. So they did basically a marathon session. I think it ends up being about 5.5 hours of them essentially walking through the entire tier, starting with sort of their prep, going through think like prep, comp, why they chose certain classes, what happened during heroic week in terms of loot, stuff like that, and then basically breaking down each and every boss, and sort of then doing a quick little wrap up. So I think you haven't had a chance to listen to all of it. I of course had a wonderful, I guess, 8 hours worth of driving a weekend or two ago,
Yep.
to and from New Jersey. Actually, it ended up being about 10 with traffic.
uh
Um, it was fun to go 200 miles. I love the Northeast of America. Um, and so I got a chance to actually listen to all of it. And it's really, if you have the chance to sit through it, I would say that you can probably end up skipping everything, like the boss disc. Well, it's funny. The weird thing about the way this works, I guess we can talk about it, but I don't know if I'd skip any of it. If anything, you skip basically the post Painsmith bosses up until
Sylvanas.
Sylvanas, because
Yeah,
like essentially they say the same thing, which is like this boss is like undertuned or tuned in a way that does not make sense, and it's like one ability or like one change away from being a good boss, which is I think what most people think.
yeah,
um the interesting though part about it, at least I don't know if you picked this up, but about the first boss was like how many times I heard either Max or Roger say this would be a great boss, an even better boss, it was later in the tier,
yeah.
right? Like
The
they
nine
can't make
being a
it
really
hard.
notable one. Yeah,
Yeah, where they were like, the 9 could have been awesome, and I think they still said it was a good boss. However, it
yeah,
would have been even better if it was later in the tier so they could ramp up the difficulty.
yeah.
Um,
The nine
and so
has
you
so many different mechanics, and it's just like you don't really have to worry about any of them except like the Armageddon soaks is the one that can really wipe you in
right.
fragment.
Yeah, and the fact that, like, the actual I guess the order isn't random, right?
Yeah,
It's a set order of abilities, so like, the certain points of the fight that are difficult, right?
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I
Oh
mean,
man, imagine if they were random and you could just randomly get Armageddon, 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 like 5 waves in a row.
yeah.
That would be awful.
Or if you got like, yeah, I mean, maybe if you couldn't get the same ability back to back, but every 3 set was randomized, so you could end up
Yeah,
with like Armageddon, like the purple soaks, and then the spread out circles as like sort of your 3 things at once, and at which
yeah,
point you just sort of sack someone. But but yeah, I mean, I think that was sort of the theme up until Painsmith, I think was, at least when I was listening to them, was essentially like early bosses really good for their position, and could have been better if they were just later in a tier, so they could have ramped up the
yeah.
difficulty of certain things.
One thing as
So
well that I think is important to note that they were very clear. Like, it doesn't make any sense to compare something like the Terragu or the Eye to something like Sylvanas or Denathrius or even something like
yeah.
Sledgefist, simply because the position a boss holds in an instance is going to play a role in the complexity and difficulty of the boss. Like,
Hmm.
they're never going to make a first boss as difficult as Sire Denathrius, right?
Yeah.
Um, so that is something as well that, like, when they're talking about these, they gave ratings to a bunch of the bosses, and so something like the 9, I don't know if this is a joke or not, but Roger gave it a 9 out of 10.
Yeah.
Um, and like, obviously, if it were the final boss of an instance, it would not be a 9 out of 10. It would be like a
Right.
1
Yeah.
because it's a 3 pull boss.
Right, exactly, yeah. Yeah, so all their I sorry, I forgot about that. They did rank every boss. I wish somebody would've wrote it down. I wish I wrote it down
Yeah.
what they ranked everything, but yeah, I mean, they were super high. It's actually really interesting to think about how they go into these bosses and sort of the things that they prepare for.
Yeah.
Um, which is I think is the fun part. And then they did so a couple of things, I guess, as we start to go through this. So got that out of the way. But I think at the start we talk when they talk about like loot and comp and things like that, right? Um, it's funny to hear some of the stories that go on PTR, which I'm not like I spend a little bit of time on PTR,
Yeah.
not as probably much as I should, but the fact that like they told stories of like their raiders having to like hide from other guild raiders because they were doing like DPS testing on things. So like there was like places where they were trying to get like real world examples of like how DPS on boss fights works. There
Yeah.
was no testing up, so they'd like go to a certain area, and I guess people would follow them around. In terms of like, I think Echo ended up in like Silver Moon City at one point
Classic.
doing some testing. So yeah, it was funny to see like they sort of talked about like trying to chase each other around like the PTR to see like what people are testing. The other thing, and I think I knew this, but maybe it's not that widely known, is that in some cases, from a mythic testing perspective, they end up using the bosses as sort of DPS checks.
Yeah, a big glorified testing dummy.
Yeah, 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 which is sort of to give them real world, like, sort of damage check examples. So and it's funny, the 2 that they used were, Terragru, but they did Terragru with no powers.
Yeah.
And
Terguru has a
then
lot of health if you don't have any powers.
yeah. Yeah, so they did that one, and they also did Soul Render, as their
Yep.
other at least I think Limit did Soul Render as their other testing boss for, like, an ad-ish fight.
Yeah.
So a fight with ad. So, it was cool to hear that, which I didn't even think about that. Like, I always thought they did their DPS testing just as they were doing the fight, but I guess it would make sense that they'd set
Yeah.
up, like, scenarios for that, so,
Yeah.
um, yeah, and then I think so that was sort of like the comp stuff to sort of get that testing done. They talked a little bit about the shard system, which I don't know if we wanna go into, but I'd forgotten about this on PTR, is that
The
shards were tradable.
yeah, the gems you could trade them. So, and since they're not tied to any specific loot spec or class or anything, you could like get 30 like one raider and 29 funnels in an instance and just kill bosses
Yep.
and trade like guarantee someone has all 9 the first week. And they made them so they're now push personal, not tradable, and obviously that changes things as
Yeah,
well as massively buffing the set bonuses.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, they talking about that was yeah, pretty interesting, and we I think we even talked about this, right? Perfecto, I think, is the perfect example from Echo, who ended up getting sat because, they didn't get the gems they wanted, and they even made this mention of, like, other classes, like, I think Limit talked about bringing in a Rep Paladin, the Rep Paladin to get the gem set, or they would've brought the Rep Paladin in, right? There was, like, was it one of their hunters who wasn't even planning to be there, but it was the only hunter that ended up getting a gem set or like a good gem set, right? Ended up having to raid Sylvanas with them,
Yeah.
which I found funny. So yeah, it was just sort of highlighting again the fact like that shard sets were so strong, and the RNG behind them sort of is a frustrating aspect of the race, right?
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of people are saying, like, I think with them being so strong, I think that was the biggest issue because there was some talk, and they talked a little bit about this about like, oh, Limit has one more item level than Echo does, or Echo had two more item levels than Limit did, right at the end of the day. But I mean, Max made a good point in terms of like the difference there is like 4 or 500 DPS over the course of a fight, right? And
Yeah.
like there wasn't a boss, even Sylvanas, wouldn't have died because or wouldn't have lived if like Echo did on one character 500 less DPS over the course of a fight, right?
Yeah.
So that he said like that was a good point of like I think people get a little bit too hung up on
The eye
like
level
the item
difference.
levels, yeah, the item level difference, right? And so and I think to Max's other point is like Echo will probably generally always have a higher item level than Limit because Echo does like many more splits than Limit does in
Okay.
terms of
Yeah.
gear funneling. So they talked through that a little bit about how like I think like Echo did something like 9 or 10 splits and Limit did like 6 or 7. So it was like just a crazy difference in terms of that piece. So um trying to think if there's any other interesting early on in the conversation before we sort of get to the Painsmith piece.
They did talk a little bit about Terra Group and how it felt bad having the power rerolling, which is something that's actually come
Oh,
up in my raid. Is like people obviously want to pick the best powers for them, um, and having the ability to reroll powers actually takes a long time to reroll your powers. Like
yeah.
if someone decides to reroll your powers and you sit there and wait for them, you're waiting 3 or 4 minutes. Um,
Yeah.
and so long. Like one person did like rerolling once and then twice. Like you could have just pulled the boss.
And killed it,
And
yeah.
the so the boss is pretty easy. Is important because it means you don't need to reroll to get like optimal damage powers. You do need someone with a stun immune power. You do
Yeah.
need a couple of unstable forms to really be safe. Um, Otherwise, the healing gets really dicey with all the fire dots that go out. But other than that, you could really go with anything. And it feels like they should have just like guaranteed that you get a certain number of those powers in the pool.
Right.
Just guarantee across the 20 people that click their things, there's going to be, 6 unstable forms and 2 beating hearts, ever beating hearts, whatever it's called, the stun immunity.
Yeah.
And just like, if your raiders don't pick it, well, that sucks. You should have, or even make it so like there's one that's always choosing between the two, so you guarantee you're
Yeah,
always
yeah,
getting
yeah.
one of them.
Exactly, yeah.
Something like that. There's
You're
like
like
other ways to address it that don't involve having people re-roll their powers.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, also re-rolling, I think, wouldn't be so bad, to your point, if you didn't have to then go back to every corpse
Yeah,
and re-pick up the
if
powers,
they
right? If
hadn't
you
made
could
it so that the stupid like enemies like leash after 20 feet because they
yeah.
so on PTR you could drag them to basically the boss room and kill them all right next to one of the pylons that you use to reset your powers.
Mhm.
And maybe that would have made it too easy to reset, but I think they actually just made things worse by
Yeah.
by making them leash so far away.
Yeah, no, yeah. Yeah, I think, to be fair, we have a rule in my guild on Terrago is you don't re-roll powers.
Yeah,
The only time we do it is if, like, we don't get, to your point, the 2 or 3 that we need.
yeah,
Um,
same. Basically, if you
yeah.
want to reroll your powers, then you have to show up before raid and clear trash, and you can reroll your powers as much as you want as long as it's not raid time yet.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's what we've done. Like, I think we start now, like, normally we start invites like 15 minutes before typical start time. So if there's enough in that initial sort of 15-minute window that they want to start clearing, they can. But those are the people that get to reroll their powers, not
Yeah,
if you show up right at right time. So,
yeah, which is a
um,
nice perk of like showing up and helping to clear trash. But
yeah,
also Terragru doesn't count for all star points, so I don't care if you got good damage powers.
exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
but we're not gonna have to worry about that for a while yet because we're extending after this reset.
Oh, you are? Oh,
Yeah,
nice. I'm wondering what yeah, I don't know what our plans are yet. The problem is, like, we still have people like me who finally got a Dom socket chest by pugging normal eye. So I have a normal Dom
yeah.
socket chest, and, like, yeah. Ugh,
Um,
I hate this game, dude.
we invested a lot of time doing heroic, uh, up until this point. Like
Yeah.
legitimately, I looked over conveniently Prog stats has it listed how much time you spent on Prog versus farm each week. We spent about 4 hours a week in Mythic for the first 4 weeks of the instance. Four hours or
Oh,
less. Which is half of our raid time, right?
yeah.
The rest of the time was spent doing heroic. And that's a lot of time. So we
Yeah.
are like in terms of hours spent progressing Mythic, pretty far behind. And the result of doing all of that heroic is that everybody has all of their set pieces. I think even there's only a couple people that have sub heroic set pieces.
Gotcha.
So we're all like good to go on that front. So we're just gonna extend at this point.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Nice, nice. Cool. So I guess back to the Max and Roger thing. I think the big boss that they spent sort of the not the most chunk of time, but a large chunk of time here was actually on Painsmith.
Yeah,
And it's funny that so this is the boss that sort of during the course of the conversation, Max basically ends up saying like, "This is where you won the instance." Is like you guys crushed at Painsmith. And it's funny because Max didn't like they didn't make excuses, but apparently they had like a couple people DC. They had some potential lag issues from some of their folks in Sweden. But Max's point was he's like, I think the reason that we as Limit didn't do as well was because of like their mentality going in, like their mentality playing the boss.
Yeah.
And, like being able to watch Echo do things, they'd be like, well, we would have died if we did that. And so rather than thinking about like solutions or like ways to sort of play into some of the like the lag issues and sort of the lag tolerances and stuff like that,
Yeah.
they basically made excuses like there's nothing I could have done there. Like this is just annoying. This boss sucks. Like in terms of a mentality, which I thought was really interesting because I think like in a lot of cases, the reason you can do something, you think you can do something is maybe not based on your play, but more based on the way your thought, like your headspace is at that time, right?
Yeah.
Um, and like limit sort of being in this like, well, we just need a pull where we don't get screwed by the game is very different than like, hey, we just need a pull where we play well, like where we do
Yeah.
the things we said we're gonna do and make those changes. So um yeah, I mean, Max, I think, came right out and was like, "This is the boss you guys crushed us on, and the reason you won, right? Like we were." He's like, "We were literally behind every other boss from here on out, like
Yeah.
regardless of when they killed it or not." Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, and I think it's funny too. Thinking about they talked a little bit about the whole like, did they think the spikes without an opening was like a bug or something? Because apparently, it was not like that on PTR. I think they
It was
said.
that was
Yeah.
new. That got
Yeah.
hot fixed in,
Yeah.
as well as the balls during the intermission. That was also
Yeah.
not on PTR.
Yeah, so they were like, yeah, so he was like really high on the fight. I think they both gave it like fairly high marks. To Max's point, like he basically said like this is where we lost, but and he's like also this is where like I think we got outplayed the most in terms of like mentality, strat and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um so yeah, so that was that piece. The I don't know if you had anything. The Painsmith, I mean, I'd rather folks actually listen to it versus like hear us talk about it because like
Right.
they went into a lot of like detail
So
about
it's up
things
on
and
YouTube. It will be linked in the description on this episode, and it does have timestamps, so you can go to their YouTube video and go, I want to listen to this talk about Painsmith, and click the thing that says Painsmith, and it will take you and like just listen to that part, not the
Mhm.
whole 5.5 hour long rambling thing.
Yeah,
Um, so would definitely recommend doing that. But yeah, it's I mean that scans basically.
yeah,
There was, you know, I mean, I haven't listened to it that part yet, so I can't
yeah,
say too much more than what you've already said, but it makes sense. Um,
yeah, yeah. So and then I guess like sort of the rest of it, not to give you too many spoilers, but I mean it was basically just like the next three bosses, like we were just disappointed, right? It's like we had a bunch
I'm not
of
surprised at that at all.
yeah. They're like they Max showed a little bit of like they had a bunch of spreadsheets around like DPS potentials for Guardians, so they were like, all right, this is
This is the
what
one
we
that
think we
gives
can
us the
do.
best shot at just killing it, and then
Yeah,
they
yeah.
do.
Yeah, and they did that from like a like having like DPS spreadsheets about what the theoretical DPS of all their raiders were. So did they need to take like 4 or 5 purging protocols? And then if they had to take 5, what are the healing cooldowns that need to be there? So a bunch of like he's like, we did a bunch of work on this, and then they did a couple things right as they got there, right? They capped the um, they basically capped the time the fight took. So they put a hard rage no matter how many purging protocols you did, which basically simplified their idea or what they needed to do. So there was no reason to push past. I think they said 3 purging protocols.
Right.
Because if you did, you'd end up at the max fight length anyway. Um, and he's like, the other side of it was it didn't have enough health. Like,
Yeah.
they basically flat out said like he's like, I think they used this boss as tuning for Sylvanas because like after they killed this boss, Sylvanas went through a number of changes in terms of like health and
Yeah.
damage and stuff
I
like
do
that.
think that this boss suffered from PTR, where when we did mythic testing on PTR and even heroic testing, there was not the piece of the description for purging protocol that said that it killed sentries.
Yeah,
So testing this boss to us, obviously not limit here, but to us it was like obviously you're not supposed to take any purging protocols, right? Like, why would you
Yeah.
take this huge burst of raid damage when standing in the pillar does huge amounts of raid damage anyway? Obviously, you're supposed to just cool down pillar, um, and just bring him in before he casts the first purging protocol, which is not the case. So, like, we were doing it as if you were trying to do zero purging protocol. It would be very hard right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
But then once they patched that description in, it became obvious, like, oh, we were supposed to be taking at least one purging protocol to kill the sentries, possibly more, and just healing through it. And
Yeah.
then that by itself gives you another, 30 to 60 seconds of damage on the boss. And I do think that they looked at things in aggregate, like
Mhm.
on that boss, and went, okay, this clearly is like tuned too high, without realizing that people misunderstood the fight.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean that was Guardians sort of crushed through that. They talked about Fate Scribe too, and so the big thing with Fate Scribe was like, of course, limits just go left strat, which is apparently something they did on PTR and it worked.
Yeah.
Um, and so the people were like, there was some rumblings at the time of like some crazy strat that Echo had to essentially do it easily, right? And apparently they built like this entire weak aura system, which this is actually where you get into the interesting part of the fight, which is like the weak auras that they had. But they had apparently a weak aura where essentially it would auto assign an individual to each mark or each row, and then that individual could basically click a button and say, I need help. And so it would automatically assign another person to go and help them, and that person would go get an alert to say, go help so and so or go help this
Yeah.
marker. Um
And it ended up being totally unnecessary because you could just go
yeah, yeah.
left.
Exactly. So you just go left, totally unnecessary, right? And the other big thing too is that the echo strat for like moving through things was essentially to say like the only people that needed to stop were the outer rings in. So like if you were in any of the inner rings, you just ran. You never stopped. You didn't care. And anyone in the outer rings would have to stop and let you by. Was sort of the Fate Scribe strat. There's probably more nuance to it, but in essence, as I was listening to it, it didn't seem like that big. Like they made it sound like it was like a whole crazy like Scripe strat in terms of like
I
building it, but
mean,
it
that
just
is a
sounded like
lot more complicated. And if that's how you
yeah,
actually had to do the boss, then it would be so much more difficult.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And I think oh
so
sorry,
we're bracing for this being a really long tier, right?
yeah,
What would you? It would be kind of neat if they were to go back and add some hard modes to Mythic in like a .5 patch and be like, Fate Scribe, you now have 10 seconds less to do the runes. Or, Guardian, you know, now I don't know what you would do with Guardian. Guardian now has
yeah,
25%, 40% more health, something like that. You
yeah, yeah,
know,
something ridiculous.
something ridiculous like that, and then just add little some of these bosses that didn't really get a fair shake the first time, especially just like
Yeah,
a hard mode, an optional hard mode that you can turn on for an achievement, and yeah,
that wouldn't be a terrible idea. But yeah, I mean, like they're gonna do something because I think we'll sort of touch on this right at the end. But this is gonna be to your point, it's gonna be a long tier, and it's not gonna be a particular, I think, difficult tier. Like the difficulty's
yeah.
not gonna hold up
We
as we
touched on
get
this
into
a
it.
little bit earlier as well.
Yeah,
This seems like early for Hall of Fame to be closing.
it does. Yeah, yeah. So that was Fate Scribe. I mean, it was the first time they talked a little bit about weak auras on other bosses, but this was the first one that had like the hey, somebody click something, it assigns someone, and I think
Yeah,
even like in phase three, like the final phase, sorry, like Roger had like a command weak aura that would basically say these are the runes that are not active, and then it would auto assign based on the ones that are active, and like that person could then like say if I need help or not. It's sort of like
yeah,
a whole thing of like assigning, yeah, the way they did it. So, um, but yeah, Fate Scribe sort of fell over. There wasn't really much to it. I think, again, disappointed that you could just go left. Apparently Echo didn't realize that during their PTR testing. They're like, somebody tried it. I don't know. I went to yell at my Raiders because he's like, somebody, I remember distinctly someone saying like, nope, not enough time to go left.
yeah.
So he's like, we never tried it in like PTR or like
The
even any of our
catch
initial attempts
is
until your kill.
that you have to be in there right away. Like, there's the
Right.
knockback that happens while the runes are still spinning. You have to be booking it onto the rings after that knockback happens in order to get
Right.
to, like, if blue spawns on the far side or the outer ring spawns on the far side, you have to already be moving for it to
Yeah.
get there in time.
Yeah. And then the other big nerf to this one too is that the beam damage, which is the mythic mechanic where a beam goes from like the center of the room to the rune that's moving, was heavily nerfed. So you just heal through it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then they go from there to Kel'Thuzad. Talk a little bit about Kel'Thuzad. I mean, most notably here was the whole like holding DPS strat.
Yeah.
Apparently, like in PTR testing, they held for like over a minute and a half. Uh, with the Kel'Thuzad not doing anything. So like this one was just one of those bosses where they're like, look, like you just the minute you can hold DPS and sort of adjust timers, they're like, not a great boss. It's funny too, Max at the time mentioned like the other thing too, from like a mana perspective, it would be great if the boss would what is it? It does this now, but it resets to 100, right, on each phase
Yes, it
change?
resets to 100.
So he's like, that's the other aspect here was like trying to manage the mana numbers. And like there was like only really he's like it ended up not mattering. There was only 2 points you never wanted the boss to end with. And I think he's like 60 and 30. If it ended with anywhere around 6 or anywhere around 30 mana, the next phase would just be off. But he's like, other than that, you just held DPS. And he's like the shards or whatever, you just popped every healer cooldown every 3 minutes
Yeah.
and killed shards and you were fine. So they didn't really spend too much time talking about this one. Um, and then they talked a lot about Sylvanas. I don't want to spend too much time because I think it's worth actually listening to this about how they go through it, how they
Yeah.
found the damage. But it was an interesting discussion, which to me, as someone who raids, like we generally don't in my guild ever talk about this. But the idea of like certain classes DPSing certain things, right? And like the fact that like having cooldowns staggered is almost always better. And it sort of turns a game like that I'm never a part of, but like the DPS game is more of a team fight where like, all right, for this phase, this DPS class, this set of classes is going to carry us. The
Yeah.
next set I'll do the other one. Right. I think the biggest thing that I ever hear is like mages talking about I'll combust this ad, and then
Yeah.
another mage will be like, I'll combust the next ad. And I'm
That's what I
like,
was gonna bring up. Like combustion now with Ravenous Frenzy on Boomkins, that same kind of thing.
mm-hmm,
We did that a little bit in my guild on the ads in Denathrius, where like we had wings
right.
assigned to certain ads and stuff like that, so that not everybody was blowing all their CDs on the ads and nuking them in 10 seconds. Most people would just put their damage on the boss, and then a couple people were assigned to do the ads.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, for us, it was interesting to hear them talk about that and how they sort of optimized or squeezed out enough DPS, over the course of those next couple of days to get that 5% and sort of, the discussions they'd have about like, all right, does it make sense to keep this class? Like, does it make sense to keep Trill on Windwalker? But they didn't need the damage in phase one, which is where they thought Trill would shine in terms of like the arrows, right?
Yeah,
And so like it sort of became this thing of like, we really need damage in this area. So what can we do there?
yeah,
So it's very much almost like the same conversation I have with my healers, like or healers in my guild about like, all right, where do healing cooldowns make sense? Was like a very similar one. In this case, it was DPS cooldowns, which was a
yeah.
cool thing to listen to. So
Yeah, I mean that's also come up a little bit this tier already with Soul Render. Having classes that are good at basically
uh,
soloing the ad waves. Windwalker, very good at that. Arms Warrior, very good at that. There's things that like Affliction Lock and Elemental Shaman. There's a few different classes that can just like basically solo them with
mhm,
CDs. Um, that are that makes the fight dramatically easier if everybody else just puts damage into the boss.
yeah. That's fair. That's fair. And just to wrap this one up, because I did want to I know we have some other stuff we want to talk about, and this one's
Yeah.
actually going long anyway.
Yeah. Classic.
Was just sort of reiterate the fact that they basically also reiterated that essentially like gear and the dom socket system in general is going to trivialize basically the second half of the instance, right?
Yeah.
Like it'll be the one tier where like they mentioned or Max went into like Denathrius held on to its difficulty as a fight up until the last week, right? Because it was very execution heavy. Like even with additional gear or additional power, you still couldn't just blow the DPS race in phase three right out of the
Yeah.
water. It got markedly easier, but like that's with people also not dying, right? And so
Yeah.
people progressing on the fight, like even late in the tier, progress on pretty much the same fight that like a second or third week kill would have progressed on.
Yeah.
Right. it would have still been different than like Echo Limit doing it, but once you got to like the third week mythic kills, like basically the fight stayed relatively the same for the entirety of this year. And in this case with Dom sockets and sort of the growing power of those Dom sockets, yeah, it's gonna trivialize pretty much everything right towards the end here.
Yep.
So um yeah, it was just my final point. And we've said that too, which
Yeah.
is like the power gain with Dom sockets.
It's
So
crazy. It's
yeah,
crazy.
yeah. Um, so cool. So, that was sort of Max and Roger's sort of tier interview. I hope they do more of these. It's super interesting to hear this stuff. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. Like
beyond just
we
like how
just
they do
did
on the fight.
the chat with them last year for Castle Nathria that was super interesting to listen to.
Hmm.
And this, yeah, I'm been meaning to finish it and just haven't gotten to it yet.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, so that is sort of that's sort of the tier in review. So yeah, so now we get to sort of transition to something we haven't really talked much about, but we'll maybe do a little bit of a quick thing. I did have two topics on here. We're gonna save one of those
I think we
topics,
saved
but
the
this,
second one for next week. Also
yeah,
means fewer spoilers this week for people that maybe
yeah,
haven't finished their campaign quest yet, like me.
yeah. So this is of course lore corner. So we will be talking pretty much about some of the lore that's happened over the course of the expansion. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the analysis of I think it was last week's, no, so not this week, but last week's cinematic and sort of the closeout of creating the new sigil of Ardenweld. Um,
Yeah,
and sort of the some of the cinematics between the Winter Queen, Elune, and Tyrande. And so essentially there is of course you are back in Ardenweld, crafting a new sigil. Tyrande's there, trying to do it, and you sort of get overwhelmed at a certain point. Um, and sort of, I think at this point too, like trying to go slightly crazy.
a
But
little
the
bit.
Winter Queen shows up. And sort of there's a couple nice cinematics between the Winter Queen trying to understand why her sister, who of course is Elune, is like in Ardenweld, right? And sort of what's going on and things like that. And there's a couple of key voice lines, and people I think got this wrong. But the idea is that Elune essentially makes this statement, and this is her voice through Tyrande, right? It goes, I heard your cries, felt your pain, and in the wake of tragedy, sent forth the cascade of souls to sustain you. So essentially, the idea there is that a lot of people read into that saying that Elune, and so the tragedy in that sentence, of course, the burning of Teldrassil, and the souls were, of course, the night elves that had perished during that burning of Teldrassil. Um, and so the issue was the Winter Queen was upset that Tyrande, or sorry, that Elune didn't sort of help them. And Elune was like, no, like I literally made sure that after this tragedy occurred, almost all the souls headed towards you, right? Headed towards Ardenwald to help you guys out because I knew you were in trouble. And people were into that thinking like, oh, Elune let Teldrassil happen, right?
Yeah,
Like, and like was okay with it. And the problem is people don't read like she literally says in the wake of tragedy, meaning like the
after it
tragedy has already
happened.
occurred.
Yeah,
So this is what happens afterwards.
yeah.
Um, and then the other piece is, of course, that because she funneled all these souls, trying to funnel them into Ardenweld, they
They
actually ended up in the
went into
maw.
the maw. Yeah,
Yeah, which is sort of another thing. And the idea though there is that nobody really knew what the jailer was doing in terms of messing with the arbiter and like sort of messing up that what is the Hogwarts the sorting cap system that they have, right?
yeah,
Um, so yeah, so I wanted to touch a little bit on this just to sort of, I guess, look at like a lot of the debate that happened when this came out, which was like Alune knew about it, knew about Teldrassil, was okay with it, and sort of now we're
yeah.
celebrating genocide, which is like
So,
not,
not what happened.
yeah,
One of the things I thought was very interesting is so those of you who played Legion will remember the Tear of Elune that we got. It was one of the artifacts for doing the things for the plot. Um,
mhm,
another Tear of Elune in this cinematic, very literal,
yeah,
and that is used as part of creating the new sigil for Ardenweald.
yeah, yeah. So it seems like there can be multiple. Like I don't, did we lose the old one? I forget.
I'm trying to remember because
Yeah,
I don't think we did. I think they were used but not consumed. I think is
gotcha.
basically what happened, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the other thing too is people sort of look at some of the decisions Elune made and how it worked is that it seemed like Elune isn't the like the all-encompassing god with like zero sort of emotion and makes all these sort of calculated decisions, right?
Yeah.
Like reading into a lot of the times of like trying to force the souls into Ardenweld seemed like very much a like my sister's in trouble. I need to save her. This is like the best thing that I can do, and not really thinking through what that action was. Um, because if she could have, she would have maybe realized that, hey, everything's being sent to the mall, right?
Yeah.
Um, and other things like that.
One of
So
the things I think is interesting about that as well is that that implies that kind of the first ones from Shadowlands and Elune are the same kind of thing, like they're all the first ones or whatever,
yeah,
which puts a lot of like old WoW lore in a weird spot.
yeah,
Um, this like what Elune is was never clear. We knew for a while that she wasn't a Titan,
right.
um, but beyond that, it was not clear. And I don't know. They're kind of positioning her as like her and the rest of the first ones as like super titans, basically.
Yeah.
Um, following that classic anime trope of just going bigger.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess we'll see how her story plays out. Like to me, Elune, like I know very little about Night Elf lore just in general, just because it was so like wishy, like almost like hand wavy, like
Yeah,
in terms of a lot of stuff where it's like, oh, it's just a loon, the goddess, and you're just like, oh, well, I know what a goddess is, so cool. I guess I get that part of it. So,
yeah,
but yeah, it's definitely some interesting points coming out of this. Particularly to your point, yeah, about what exactly is a loon, and then at the end of the day, like how will she interact moving forward now that we've seen sort of almost like a I'm gonna say a human personality to her, but like a not just a calculated god type character, right?
yeah,
Definitely a little bit more personable. It seems like she cares about her sister, in this case. Um, so that's the lore corner for this week. Just a little bit about the Elune cinematic. I honestly I just wanted to get past the whole like Elune killed a bunch of people or was okay with a bunch of people dying because I feel
yeah.
like
Is
missing
incorrect.
the whole like wake of tragedy thing. So,
Yeah,
yeah. Um, so uh, so yeah, so that is the lore corner for this week, and we're being slightly brief just because we think we still ran a little bit long, and I do want
yeah,
to get to the questions for this week
yeah. We've been
to get
putting them
into.
off for too long.
Yeah. So cool. So thank you. Spoilers over, and now we get into my favorite part of the show, Q&A. So you guys can of course send your questions to Emerson and I. We will answer them and try and answer them as best we can. Um, and so the first question, which I think is a detailed question, which we want to spend probably the most time on,
Yeah,
is a question from Mountain. And so Mountain's got a long sort of list,
I
or
can
sorry, a long
probably
description.
I can probably summarize this one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. If you want to take a stab at it.
So basically, they are asking about simming and how do you take simming from like just plugging things into raid bots to like actually really using simming and doing it in a way that's going to be most helpful to you. So, for example, what options would you use on some of the fights this tier? Patchwork versus hectic ag cleave, number of targets, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
What are some of the limitations and pitfalls? And then how frequently should you sim? And how do things like Blood Mallet and Warcraft logs kind of tie into simming? And it's a really really detailed and very good question, and we could probably honestly dedicate a whole episode to answering it because we both kind of are involved in this theory crafting space that uses sims and things like sims a lot.
Yeah.
But I think there are actually relatively brief answers to a lot of those questions.
Yeah.
um so the easiest one to answer: how often should you sim your character? After every piece of gear. Every time you get a piece of gear, you should be simming your character. Before you put it on, you should be figuring out, is this even better? The rest of the questions are related to how you decide whether the sim is good enough for making that determination, basically. Um, so, for example, um, Sims are very limited when it comes to mimicking fight timings. If a boss has a damage amp phase every minute, that's obviously going to make a trinket that's on use that does a bunch of damage every minute a lot better than a trinket that does maybe a little bit more damage every 90 seconds. Something like that, where that was like Sludge Fist. Every minute, basically, he took double damage. And Sims are never going to reflect that. There are also instances, Brewmaster has dealt with this a lot, where damage profile plays a big part for us in how the relative value of things that impact Invoke Niazao versus other things. Been a real struggle, let me tell you. Um, so things that maybe buff Invoke Niazao are very sensitive to how we tune the Sims damage versus how much damage you actually take, and even what the damage patterns are
Yeah.
in an actual fight. Something like Reactive Defense Matrix is a great example of this, where it's not literally Invoke Niazao, but it depends very much on when and how you take damage. And so it under Sims right now, um, compared to how it does in practice, due to a couple of factors related to that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, and so from a if we take sort of the healer perspective of this one, right? Like generally speaking, the idea of like we don't have Sims in the way that like DPS or tanks do,
Right.
right? But the idea is you always look at gear after every piece you get, right? Like there's not a way to get around that.
Yeah.
And I think that the biggest thing from a gearing perspective too is, from a healer point of view, there's really not much that we can do, right? In terms of like adding or subtracting stats. Generally a stat is, if it's good at, you know, the first piece of gear you get of a tier, right, it'll be good pretty much through the tier. At least for Mistweavers in general, right? So you'll always continue to look at, in our case, like crit and verse, right?
Yeah.
Always going to be strong, like regardless. But I think to the point of like utilizing other tools like Warcraft logs or
Yeah.
anything like that to inform gearing decisions. I think the biggest thing that you'll see is like particularly in like trinket usage, where if there are certain mechanics as a healer that you can negate or support through specific trinket usage, that'll
Yeah.
be something that's present in logs. It won't be present in Sims. So similar to your like damage amp example, like there are examples of using like Tuft from Sun King
Yeah.
in terms of like large tank hits or large individual hits to be able to save someone.
Yeah.
And other things like that, which is where they'll present themselves in logs just based on usage. Um, the only tough part with healer logs is that if you only look at the top ones, it's
They're doing something
very,
cheesy. Yeah.
yeah, it's very skewed to like them trying to push as much healing as they can and maybe not doing what you would do from a progression standpoint. So
Brewmaster is largely the same. If you look at the top damage logs for Brewmaster, it's not so bad right now because most people are still progressing and are on
yeah.
like early farm, if that. Um, but in a month, all of the top Brewmaster logs on every single boss will be doing disgusting things to cheese Angry Dave damage. All
Yeah.
of them. I
Yeah.
had on Sludge Fist last year, I had like rank 15 or something from solo tanking, so I took double damage during Invoke Niazao windows, and that was rank 15. The rank 1 was like 2k DPS or 2.5k DPS above me, solely based on like doing even more degen stuff by like canceling their dodge stacks and sitting during Angry Dave to take even more damage.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a lot of cheese uh, that goes on when you look at top logs. But I do think that logs are honestly the best. Like one thing that I think people are really in general bad at is, and this is not just a WoW thing. In general, in real life thing, people are very bad about like taking a critical view on the tools that they use. Something like
Yeah.
Simcraft or QE Live is great and does a lot of important, like performs a very important function for us, but it's not perfect, and it is important to like take a critical look at it and go, okay, is this like this is doing one thing? Is this thing that it's doing actually mapping to the fight, right?
Right. Yeah.
Something like Brewmasters were at the beginning of this tier dramatically over simming because what we usually do for boss damage, take boss damage done, is we take the hardest hitting boss of the tier, and like that's the damage profile, and that's usually like high end of heroic, low end of mythic. Except this time that boss was guardian, and his auto attack damage was literally double the next highest boss. Um,
Didn't make
so
too much sense there.
that one didn't really make sense, so we changed it to Soul Render, and we made some other changes to help make Invoke Niazao not like dramatically over sim. But if you were looking at it the first 2 weeks of the tier, like you would have been seeing Invoke Niazao doing 20 to 30% of your damage, and everything that made Invoke Niazao better would have been like dramatically outperforming anything that didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean that's similar with like with healers in terms of like it's less about like individual play and individual gear at that point for us, right? It's more about like as a group, what is a group of healers doing, right? Because I think at a certain point, and healers are sort of in this interesting space in that a lot of times gear means very little, or we get very little gear at the end of the day,
Yeah,
right? And so a lot of times it's just based on like the rest of your team and like in certain cases, like some healers will just do a lot of HPS because they get to use their cooldowns at like
yeah.
the right spots, right?
That's
And
something to
you
be
as
careful of in logs too. If you're looking at
yeah,
healers, like especially something like a disc priest that has very specific CD timings. Um,
right.
if you are comparing like two disc priests and one of them gets their CD out and the other one has the raid wipe just before their boon goes off, you know, one of those is gonna have a lot better healing than the other.
Oh yeah. Yeah, like there was a Mistweaver log that came out. It was like something like 13 or 14k HPS on Nerzul, and people were freaking out. And like you look at the log, and the guy or the individual got two perfect revivals, basically like shattered hit with like not a DR up, and he hit revival with like a trinket, like with his trinket up, and I think he was underneath the Venthyr, the Theatar like
Umbrella,
mastery
yeah,
umbrella, and just like top the raid both times. Just like, well, like that's just, and it wasn't like planned. He was like, they actually came into the to chat to talk a little bit, and they were just like, wasn't planned, just got lucky. Like that's sometimes with healer logs, it's just like that. So,
yeah, yeah.
um, but
Or
I definitely think you could. Okay.
um, there was one log I remember specifically looking at. Again, we're gonna go back to Invoke Knees Out because it's such a big part of Brewmaster damage. It's like our major CD basically.
Yeah.
Um, there was one early on where we were trying to help someone who was like, why is this other person getting so much more damage from Invoke Neozao than I am? And we look at it, and it's like one of their Invoke Neozao casts, they barely dodged anything. They weren't even like canceling stacks, they just didn't dodge very much. And also, Stomp crit. All of like the major damage from Invoke Neozao for one of them just crit all of it. Because there's only like 5 stomps per cast. So it's pretty reasonable when you're running 30% crit to just sometimes, 1 in 100 times, you're gonna end up critting all 5
That's
and just
hilarious.
deal double damage. And that's exactly what happened.
Jesus, that's hilarious.
And that's just luck.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. So yeah, so I mean, I think there's to your point, that critical thinking, like you can't just pick up something someone did and sort of just reuse it or copy and paste onto your character, because there is a little bit of nuance there,
Yeah,
uh, in terms of why they're making decisions and what they're doing. So,
yeah.
um,
And I think that's so for me, I think logs and Simcraft, QE Live in the healer case, are like the two pillars for figuring out gearing. Um, logs are like perfectly realistic. They are literally something that happened, but the person is not going to be playing perfectly. In some cases, like there's a situation with Venthyr Brewmaster logs where most of
mhm,
them are
yeah,
not experienced brewmasters, so they're actually playing it pretty poorly. So Venthyr looks worse in logs than it actually is. Um, so and it's also susceptible to variance because you can get those perfect revivals, and it's just
yeah,
luck. Whereas something like QE Live or SimC is not as realistic, and just can't be as realistic. But because of the way they work, they really even out the variance. So you're going to get something that is like representative of someone playing very well,
mhm,
and uh, deals with the variance and presents you with like a typical case of like here's how it's going to usually work,
yeah,
as opposed to like, oh, I got 2 perfect revivals, or oh, I crit everything in Invoke Nizao.
yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, there's always those variances you have to basically look at like, don't just look at the top level summary, right? It's
Yeah,
like the typical, like, don't just read the title of a story, actually read the story, right? Like,
right.
so dig in a little bit, I think, to figure it out. But no, I mean, I think in terms of the question, you sort of in anything you use as many different sources of information as you can that you can trust,
Yeah,
and sort of just make your decisions on gear there. I mean, unfortunately for me, like the question always comes back to, like, at the end of the day, like, you could just equip your highest item level stuff, and if you play better than everybody else,
you'll be
like,
fine.
generally you're going to be fine.
Yeah.
And
I
the
mean,
only people you
there
lose to,
there are Venthyr brewmasters higher progressed than I am, so
yeah,
it's not a
yeah,
big
and and I think at the end of the day, like, the playstyle aspect, I think always makes more sense. But yeah, people put a lot of time into, like, the gear, the sims, and it's an interesting question to answer. Um, but yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's the playstyle makes more sense. But if you're gonna talk about gear, it's like, yeah, sim after every new piece. I think sims in general, like, I don't know if this is something you do, Emerson, but like, if I'd sim for whatever fight is coming up next, right? So if I knew a
yeah,
fight was like needed a particular thing or a particular style of healing, I might
adjust
adjust,
it, yeah.
yeah, based on that, or maybe what I was progressing on. So, um, sort of those are sort of some minor, I think, optimizations you can make in terms of, like,
I usually
yeah,
turn to spreadsheets for that because of, like, how difficult it is to get specific, like, fight timings in SimC.
that's true. Yeah.
So to give an example of that, the cooldown reduction on weapons of order from hitting AoE targets, I put together a spreadsheet to figure out, okay, can I get an extra cast by holding weapons of order to always use it on ads on Soul Render and Painsmith? And the answer is basically no, as long as you're not like dumb. If you just like YOLO your weapons of order right before the intermission starts on Painsmith, you're going to lose a cast. It's
Gotcha.
just gonna happen. But if you do it reasonably intelligently and you go, oh, orbs are spawning in 5 seconds or ads are getting gripped in 5 seconds, I'm gonna hold weapons of order for 5 seconds and get that extra 40 seconds of cooldown reduction. Then, as long as you're like doing something reasonably intelligent like that,
Yeah.
you can't get an extra cast by sitting on the, which is like
Gotcha.
one of the things uh, I was like, but I don't do a lot of like simming AOE. Uh, in particular, for me, it's like there's nothing for me to do differently. Like the only thing
Gotcha.
I can do really is try to line up either Invoke Knees Out or Weapons of Order or both with AOE. But
Gotcha.
obviously, for something like Windwalker, that's a little bit different. Where one thing that we've had people do in my raid group for figuring out PI values is had them sim just do like a 1 minute sim with um, Bloodlust turned off, and you can control the health threshold that the boss starts at. And then, so like you're looking at, okay, well, who do we want to PI during execute? Like on Remnant. Okay, so we are going to have Lust, it was going to be an execute, so setting up basically a 1 minute sim and starting the boss at like 30% health. Bloodlust happens. What do you sim at? Like
Yeah.
doing that kind of thing. So that kind of thing can be very valuable. I personally don't do it very much because Brewmaster doesn't have a lot of things to vary.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think for healers, it's generally not um too much different. But yeah, probably for DPS, it might make better sense if they know they're going into an ad fight or something like that. If their
Yeah.
stats wildly change between that type of damage
Yeah,
profile.
I know
So,
there's probably instructions specifically for soul render simming in the
mhm,
different wind channels that it would be useful to look at.
gotcha. Cool. All right. So I know we're slightly over, but I do want to at least get this next question since we've
Okay,
held off a
so
couple a
long.
couple weeks now. Yeah. So this comes from Bill's 12 ounces. And they ask, it's another long one, but basically what they went through is they basically prioritized the first couple weeks, working on their PvP ranking, and sort of deprioritized some of their PvE, um, sort of farming and things like that, and ended up with sort of a chest or the Great Vault, right, with some gear pieces that overlapped Dom socket slots, not realizing the power that Dom sockets had. Um, so the question that they ask is, was the gear nerfs for PvP gear warranted from a PvE perspective? Which I didn't realize there was gear nerfs. I'm assuming they mean like the top level, eye level changes,
Yeah,
right? Where PvP gear is slightly
yeah,
lower and top level, item level than PvE stuff. And they're sort of just slightly frustrated, I think, with the fact that they put a bunch of time into seemingly thinking they could gear through PvP for PvE,
Yeah.
and make up it that way. And
I
I'll
think
be completely
the
or sorry.
examples they give are all things where like the gear in PvE has like special bonuses. It's the
Yeah,
domination sets, it's the Painsmith weapons, that kind of thing. And I mean, using the Painsmith weapons as an example, you can't guarantee you're going to get those. You can
right.
guarantee that you're going to get the PvP ones. And I think that's the correct way to look at it. Because PvP gearing is very consistent, and you can guarantee that you are going to get your weapon. You are going to have a 246 weapon. Whereas, like, I'm using a 239 Painsmith weapon and a 233 weapon from last year.
Yeah,
Because I still have not gotten the second one hander. So, if I had done PvP, I would have been actually pretty happy to get a 246 plus a 239. That's better than what I have.
yep,
So I think the idea that PvP gear is just going to be like a replacement for PvP gear in PvE content is just not true. Even in PvP, I think using Painsmith weapons is probably better.
yep. Yeah, and I think the other side of it too is that you sort of if you I think the way that Blizzard wants you to gear and the way that they've set it up is that if your focus is on a specific type of content, that will always be the main source of gear to complete that type of content.
Yeah,
So like in all honesty, just to be pretty frank, like you just made a bad call, Bills 12 ounces in terms of like what you prioritize the first couple weeks in sort of taking the time to prioritize
I
PvP
don't
over
even
PvE.
I don't even think that that's necessarily their frustration because if you read the end of the question, they talk about I ended up forfeiting heroic raid gear that would have let me complete my set bonus. I still don't have my set bonus yet, and although my eye level is pretty reasonable, my parses and effectiveness in raid are pretty mediocre. I think the real crux of the issue is forfeiting those set items. Um,
Yeah,
there's so maybe for one person it was eye level and the set, and for you it was just the set, but the set blows everything else out of the water. Like my paladin has a 252 mythic plus chest because at like 1 week I got to choose chest or shoulders, and like I needed the chest more.
yeah.
If I go tomorrow and I do LFR and I get the blood chest off of what is it, the eye or the Terragru that drops it
Yeah,
from plate,
I
um
or Target, sorry.
then I will I'll wear a 213 over a 252, and there is nothing that is going to change that because of how powerful those set bonuses. So that's something where the issue I think is not PvP gear versus PvE gear. It's actually coming back to the set bonuses being so incredible. Like if this were a monk set item had dropped for you, would you have given that up um over a PvP because you had a PvP piece of gear? Like no, we'd have kept the set bonus because it turns on your set. And I think
Right.
trading away, your unholy helm or something to someone else because you already had a 252 or a 246 from PvP, um, like is doing that same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's well, that was my point about the prioritization, right? So
Yeah, yeah,
if you had to like if you were gonna prioritize pushing PvP ranking and not getting your 9 heroic kills, so you had a full line
yeah,
of like options at that point, right? That was the mistake in terms of like just not realizing I think the power that these things had.
yeah.
So, and I think
My read was that they were like trading stuff away, but I guess the question's not clear, so
yeah, yeah, and I read it more like they
they
put more
just
focus
yeah
on a
they
certain
didn't
type of
get the
content.
heroic clear in, so they didn't get
Yeah, yeah,
the three vault from raid. Yeah,
yeah. Yeah, which is sort of the I think the crux of it is yeah,
yeah.
it's just the way
Either
that
way,
Blizzard set it up.
yeah. The key issue is like if you're going to be raiding, you need to be prioritizing the set bonus, and
Yeah, the
nothing
gear that
else even
comes from
comes
PvP.
close.
Yeah. Yep, yep, yep. No, that makes sense. So, well, thank you, Bills, for the question. Unfortunately, I think it's always going to be like this, where Blizzard's going to want you to do the content and get
Yeah,
gear from the content that you're doing versus sort of cross pollinating. Although, at least for the bulk of it, there might be one or two items that are good, but they'll never make like the major system for like PVE. Right? Will always be the system that you want to interact with the most or get gear that supports that the
yeah.
most. So,
I mean, like again, the PvP system is super consistent, and that's really where I think most PvE players get value from it. Is that
yeah,
you're always going to be able to guarantee that you get a specific item that you need, where you cannot do that in PvE.
yeah.
But that is all the time we have for today. We are about 10 minutes over because we love to talk.
Exactly.
And that means that we're gonna go ahead and wrap up the show. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will be back next week, same time, same place, to talk about. I'm not sure yet. We will figure it out though.
We'll see. We'll have
We'll see.
something.
We got more lore to talk about, more questions to answer,
Yeah.
and well, maybe we'll talk a little bit. Maybe we'll take a break from WoW stuff. Maybe we'll talk about Diablo 2 next week.
Oh, we could do that.
Could do that.
Or I
Or
did something,
Painsmith.
Emerson. I did something, Emerson.
What?
I I installed Final Fantasy 14.
Ooh, we could talk about that.
We could. We'll see though.
We could talk about that. But yeah, that's going to be it for the show this week. If you enjoyed it and you want to support the show, you can do that over at our Patreon at patreon.com/Beak of Serenity. That supports not only the show, but also the website, the guides, all the work that we do for theory crafting and all that work on Sims and things like that. And of course, if you want to support us, but you don't want to or aren't able to do that financially, please join the Discord. Come hang out in Brew Lounge or Mist Lounge or Wind Lounge and just, chill out, answer questions, ask questions, and have a good time. But that's it for today. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you next week.
Bye.